Sorry, good morning, everyone. And welcome to our webinar, Skilled Trades in Peel Halton Regions, What the Data Shows and What Employers Say. My name is Shalini Takuna, and I'm the Executive Director for the Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. We were scheduled to release the findings from this research on March 27th at the Mississauga Convention Center, for which some of you were registered to attend. For obvious reasons, we had to cancel the event and had anticipated to hold it when things normalized from the current pandemic. I think you will all agree with me that the world around us has changed radically in the last 3 to 4 weeks. Recognizing that there is a lot of uncertainty around the timings for what we would call normal, we determined that it's best we share this information at the earliest so it is useful to our partners and stakeholders. How this report came about. This report is one of 26 reports prepared by workforce planning boards requested by the Ontario Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development, providing an up-to-date picture of the state of skilled trades across the province. The Peel Halton Workforce Development Group based its findings on labour market data, analysis and employer survey, and interviews with over 50 employers and key informants. This was a very complicated and intense research to undertake, considering that there are over 140 trades. Our presentation today will give you a more accurate number, considering the diversity of the trades and those represented in Peel Halton, also considering the inconsistency in what is tracked as far as trades are concerned and what should be tracked to give us some consistent, robust understanding around skilled trades. And most importantly, due to data limitations, leading us to map different data sources to piece together an understanding of the skilled trades. We will get a very sound understanding about the challenges, data limitations, and most importantly, an understanding of the skilled trades locally and provincially from today's presentation. Many of you are probably familiar with the consultant that led this research for the Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. Tom Zizis has worked for over 2 decades as a consultant in the public, not-for-profit, and international development fields. For the last 15 years, he has specialized in employment programs and labor market analysis, particularly for economically marginalized communities. Tom regularly makes presentations to policy-making bodies and frequently is a keynote speaker at conferences focusing on the consequence of a changing labor market. He has taught public policy, program evaluation, international development, and community economic development courses at York and Ryerson University. Without much further ado, I would now like to hand over the platform to Tom.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It feels like I'm out of the house, even though I'm still in my home office. But this is the first time in 5 weeks I've worn a dress shirt, so it's a special occasion. I imagine many of you are also sitting at home watching this, so make yourself comfortable. We expect this presentation should last approximately 45 to 50 minutes. As was mentioned, we're happy to take questions, particularly if there's on a slide, if something is unclear, type in a question, we'll try and answer that right away. And in terms of broader policy issues, consequences, and so on, we'll have an opportunity to also have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So I have a slide deck, which I'm now going to move us to. There we go. So, as Shalini mentioned, this was a project that was initiated by the provincial government, starting around late spring, May, June. Each of the local employment planning councils and workforce planning boards were asked to undertake a study that was focusing on skilled trades in their local area. The ministry also had prepared a specific list of questions they wanted to see answered, and they directed the boards to engage with employers and only employers in understanding what skilled trades were in demand. And I think it's important to highlight this because this was quite unusual. Typically, workforce planning boards kind of develop their own work plans, and this might be one of the very, very few times that the ministry actually directed all boards to undertake a study, a common study, and to undertake it in a particular sort of way. And I think it underscores what importance the ministry was placing on this initiative. So as I said, there were specific questions that were given to the boards to use as the basis for consultations with employers. The major themes were focusing on which skilled trades were hardest to fill in the local area. There were also questions relating to the recruitment and training and retention of apprentices and journeypersons. How in circumstances of shortages, employers were dealing with those challenges, and also some questions about the overall apprenticeship system. So as we go through the presentation, we will be speaking to some of those items. The other part of this assignment was that the ministry also required each of the workforce planning boards to provide kind of a common reporting to the ministry. So this is a kind of a online reporting system. It was highly prescribed, very structured, and very focused on those initial questions that the ministry had proposed. Now, that being the case, for us as a planning board, we also wanted to make sure that we situated these questions within a context. So our own work plan included not only the specific questions that the ministry had directed us to inquire about, but also we undertook a literature review. We wanted to understand what previous work and studies, analysis had been done in this field. We had access to various forms of data that included census data, as well as Ontario College of Trade registration data. So we wanted to use that as a context for understanding the situations in Peel and Halton. In undertaking these questions, these consultations, we did it in several ways. We developed an employer survey so that we can reach out to a larger number of employers. In the end, we had around over 300 employers go to the survey. The survey was actually very structured because we wanted to focus any individual employer's question on a specific trade. And so as a result, there was quite a kind of set of pathways that were developed in order to ensure that we were able to capture the information on each specific trade. We also engaged in interviews. In the end, we had almost 40 interviews with employers. We did reach out to other key informants because we wanted to get the perspective of individuals who are providing employment services. We wanted to speak to the school boards that were providing youth apprenticeship programs. We wanted to speak to the colleges who are also providing apprenticeship programs. So those key informants covered those various sectors. We also spoke to a number of industry and employer groups. So in the end, this project was completed in mid-January, which was when the reporting was due to the ministry. And we also prepared a separate report to the community, to the various stakeholders who participated in this, and to the larger audience, yourselves included. And so there is actually a narrative report that will be released covering the findings, the same material that you're going to be seeing in this presentation. So let me provide a bit of context. I think among you, there are some who are very heavily involved in apprenticeships and in skilled trades, either as employers or as training providers. So you would be well familiar with some of this. And some of you may only be involved with one or two trades or only tangentially involved in issues related to skilled trades. So as Shalini mentioned, there's over 140, actually 144 skilled trades in Ontario. Recently, I think around a bit over a year ago, around 10 trades were delisted because they were hardly being applied in Ontario. So the number has been reduced to 144. Of those, there are 23 compulsory trades. So what that means is that a person cannot practice in that occupation without being licensed. The licensing had been done by the Ontario College of Trades. That body has since, the ministry, the government has announced that they are winding that down, but the form in which the registration process currently is still present. So these trades, an individual cannot work in that occupation if without having that license. So the rest of the trades are what are called voluntary. Okay? So clearly the vast majority of these trades are voluntary. 80 of these trades have a certificate of qualification exam. So having completed your training on the job and classroom instruction, there's actually an exam that one has to pass. The others have what are known as a certificate of apprenticeship, which means that one has completed all the activities related to an apprenticeship. The other thing, sorry, when I mentioned about compulsory trades and licensing and the Ontario College of Trades, there's also a registration process. But the registration is only required for compulsory trades and individuals who are apprentices. So the data we have is kind of incomplete because it doesn't include anyone who may be practicing in that area. And I'm going to get into that issue a bit later when we talk about some of the statistics. Finally, even though there are 144 skilled trades, it warrants emphasizing that actually, if one counts all the people who are registered in trades, in particular registered, those trades are limited to only really a small number of trades, and we'll show that with some of the data. Trades are categorized into four groupings: construction, industrial, motive, power, and service. So construction are your probably the better known trades, what we usually think of in terms of skilled trades, individuals who are working as electricians or plumbers or carpenters. Industrial typically is related to the manufacturing sector. So occupations like welders, tool and die makers, industrial like electricians, for example. Motive power has to do with all the trades that are related to the mechanics working on vehicles. So truck and trailer technicians, automotive service technicians. And finally, the broad service sector. The best known trades in those categories are hairstylists and chefs and cooks. So let me mention a few things about the numbers, because in describing some of the challenges we have in understanding the numbers, it also gives you a sense of what we're talking about when we're commenting or analyzing these occupations. The trades are defined by legislation and are identified by different programs that provide specialized training. They don't necessarily correspond to how we understand all occupations. Occupations are defined by Statistics Canada, and sometimes there's not an equal equivalence between a trade and the occupation it's in. So I'll give you a couple examples. There's an occupation that includes auto service technicians. It's also bus and coach technicians and a few others. So that occupation is an auto service technician occupation, but there's actually around 8 trades that fit under that grouping: auto service, transmission mechanics, automotive electronic accessory mechanics. So it's not possible to unpack some of those more specialized trades under that one occupation. Secondly, we have, for example, an occupation that includes both hairstylists and barbers. Hairstylists are a trade, and actually a compulsory trade. Barbers are not a trade. So there's no specialized apprenticeship process to become a barber, but there is for a hairstylist. The distinction between compulsory and voluntary trades means that when it comes to registration, sometimes the numbers under registration are quite out of proportion, make up a very small fraction of the actual number of people who are employed in that occupation. So for example, we have an occupation called transport truck driver. There actually is an apprenticeable trade for commercial truck drivers. It's not particularly well known. It's a voluntary trade. And as an illustration, I've put the numbers up here. In Peel, in 2016, we had 25,000 residents who were employed as transport truck drivers. Under the registration numbers, because this is a voluntary trade, we had only 51 people who were registered as a commercial transport driver. So, a huge discrepancy. One number does not tell us what actually exists in terms of this large labor market. On the other hand, an occupation like electrician, here we have 4,000 residents of Peel and Halton who are employed as electricians. And yet when we look at the registration numbers, we actually have slightly over 7,000 in Peel and Halton who are registered as electricians. I can't even explain to you why there's such a discrepancy. It's a huge discrepancy, but that just gives you a sense of some of the challenges we have in dealing with these numbers. There are also, when we started looking at this further in terms of the data, we realized there are certain occupations that while they're not skilled trades occupations, they kind of depend on skilled trades often as the feeder or the talent pipeline for those occupations. And an example I put up here are the occupation of contractors and supervisors in carpentry trades. So this is a specific occupation under Statistics Canada, but it is not a trade. But anyone who's going to be a supervisor of carpenters or a contractor of carpenters is often very likely have been a carpenter themselves. And so that's another area when we started looking at the numbers that we wanted to explore as part of the study. So we'll be talking about that in a moment. Okay, so let me start getting to some numbers. So these are the top 10 trades by registered journeypersons, as well as registered apprentices. Starting first with Peel region. This is data from October 2019. So a couple of things I'll point out. So we have the names of the trades listed. The bolded ones are compulsory trades. So you'll see that most of the top ones are compulsory trades because these are registration numbers and they are required to register. Secondly, you'll see how the numbers quickly fall off. We have around 4,000 electricians, around 3,600 automotive service technicians, 3,000 hairstylists. Then it drops by around the 6th listing, it's already under 1,000. And by the 10th listing, we're down to just a few hundred. In total, I think this list of 10 I think it accounts for a bit over 80% of all registered skilled tradespersons in Peel. But you can see the most prominent ones, the ones that are, roughly 1,000 or more: electrician, auto service technician, hairstylist, truck and coach technician, plumber, and refrigeration and air conditioning systems mechanic. Then we have, you see at the bottom, we have industrial mechanic, millwright, industrial electrician. Those are trades in the industrial sector, so the manufacturing sector. And you see the numbers for apprenticeships on the side as well, okay? All right, so that's Peel. Here's Halton. So Halton is a smaller jurisdiction, but a couple of things I'll point out. First of all of the trades here, as you can see, they're all compulsory. The top 6 are exactly the same as the Peel ones. Here, I'm going to go back for a second. Here's Peel, here's Halton. The top 6 are the same ones. Again, that same drop-off in numbers. Again, I think these top 10 account for slightly over 80% of all registered journey persons in Halton. Okay. But in Halton, as you see, we don't have those industrial trades. We have others in here: the auto body, the repairers, the hoisting engineer, the mobile crane operator. Okay. I will mention as well that in doing this study, I also was doing the study for around 5 other workforce planning boards across the province. And I will tell you that in terms of those top 6 trades that we see here, it was actually very similar in terms of other jurisdictions, whether it was Simcoe or whether it was Muskoka or whether it was Nipissing. You'd see they're pretty much the same numbers. Now, this is a busy slide, so let me explain it. I wanted to go back to that comparison I spoke to you about before, where we have the number of registered trade persons, and compared it to the number of employed residents. So that second column, registered trade persons, is from the Ontario College of Trade. It's 2019 data. The next column, employed residents, is from the 2016 census. So there's a couple of years difference, but we're looking at, trying to get in the ballpark. And the third column is the percentage of those trades in registered tradespeople in comparison to how many employed residents there are. And I broke this up into 3 categories because I saw 3 patterns in the data. Number one, so the first grouping are compulsory trades. We've listed around 4 trades there. And you'll see as a percentage that pretty well, apart from the electricians, that's a kind of an outlier, but everyone else is within like around 94 and 125%. Like it's all within the same range. They're all close to 100% of one another. That the number of registered trade persons was pretty well very close to the number of employed residents. 2 different sets of data, but it gives us some comfort that actually they're measuring the same thing in the same way. Okay. So the next category, or let's say the next 2 categories, have to do with voluntary trades. And we saw 2 patterns in voluntary trades. One, there are certain voluntary trades where the percentage of people who are registered was slightly higher, and another where the percentage of people who are registered was very, very low. So let's take those ones with higher registration numbers. Here we have carpenters and construction millwrights. Now, when I say higher, we're not talking about compulsory trades. Like there, it's around 100%, the equivalence between those who are registered and the numbers for employment. Here, it's around, between 10 and 20%. Sometimes in some other areas, you'd see it as high as 30%. What does that mean? It means that even though they were voluntary, they saw some value to being registered. To having completed, to be able to show that they could demonstrated that they were had passed all the requirements and they were kind of officially recognized. And I think what that means is, for example, in the case of carpenters, while they're voluntary, many of them would be self-employed, like the numbers for self-employment must be around 30 or around 30%. So it helps them on their truck or in their, in their business promotion material to show a license number to kind of validate that they are recognized in some way. And I think that's one of the things that's involved there. We also found that among certain manufacturers, they really did want to see people have their certificates, and so being registered perhaps was another way in order to demonstrate one's employability. Then we have these voluntary trades with low registration numbers. So, cooks, welders, transport truck drivers was an example we gave before. And there are a couple of things I think going on here. In some cases, we have other ways in establishing people's credentials. Like welders have a Canadian Welding Bureau that provides certification for welding that is different from the apprenticeship system. And there's an alternative way to establish one's, to go through a training process and to develop one's standing or demonstrate one's abilities. Truck drivers, we have all kinds of, commercial driving licenses and driving schools and whatnot. So some of that goes on. Cooks, cooks is, for many jobs in cooks in fast food outlets or in restaurants, there's not as high a requirement in terms of the skills that are often acquired on the job. So anyway, but the point here is that, even among these trades, we have different levels of registration and different levels also of people even completing the apprenticeship that seems to reflect expectations of employers or expectations of consumers or customers about having these skills qualified. Okay. All right. This next slide shows the apprenticeship numbers for Peel and Halton, and they vary from year to year. So we're showing here those numbers at the top are 2013 to 2014 because we're doing a fiscal year. That's the way the data is collected. 2014, 2015, all the way up to 2018, 2019. We gave it for the top 6. Turns out all of these are compulsory trades. You'll see those top 6, they're exactly the same top 6 that are the highest number of journeyperson registrations for Peel and Halton. Not in the same order necessarily, but still in the top 6. The other thing to point out, if you kind of just scan the numbers from left to right for each row, you'll see that in most instances, actually in every instance, now that I look at it, the numbers have increased. So we have been seeing, particularly in these trades, growing registration numbers, more people becoming apprentices. Not to say they're all completing these apprenticeships, but more recently, there's been more attention, more push to get more people to go into apprenticeships. And certainly these numbers in Peel and Halton show that people are entering apprenticeships, are registering as apprenticeships in increasing numbers. Okay, so let me get here now to, after having gone through some of the data, here we get to some of the survey results. So this question was, we asked employers their degree of difficulty in hiring a journey person or an apprenticeship. And I'm going to ask you to, first of all, just focus on the top box and the first line. So that's all employers answering this question. Is 41% say it's very difficult to hire a journey person, and 32% say it's difficult. The column at the end to the extreme right shows the combined result for very difficult or difficult. So 72% of employers said it was very difficult or difficult to hire a journey person. Then because we had slightly larger numbers, we could break them down by different categories. So the next 3 rows show different size of employers. with 5 to 19 employees, 20 to 99, and so on. You can see if you go to that last column that the smaller the firm, the greater difficulty they had in hiring a journey person, going from 80 to 75, and then those who had 100 or more employees is only 67%. Then we broke it down by those 4 categories of trades: construction, industrial, motive, and service. And you can see that essentially construction had the least difficulty. Only around 50% said it was very difficult, and all of them, the other 3, were all within the same range, between 75 and 79%, saying very difficult or difficult. Okay. And then the bottom box shows the comparison between the degree of difficulty hiring a journey person and the one of hiring an apprentice. And as you can see, there's actually quite a fair bit of difference, right? 72% saying it's very difficult or difficult to hire a journey person. And at that last column, 47% saying it's very difficult or difficult to hire an apprentice. Then we wanted to know what employers, how they forecast the future. So we asked them both about demand and supply. We said, will the demand increase or decrease or stay the same for the skilled trade that you're hiring for? And will the supply increase or decrease? So now again, this survey was undertaken in September and October of 2019. So different economic circumstances than what we're facing now. But at that time, we had 3/4 of employers say we think the demand for the skilled trade that they hire for is going to increase. But only around half thought that the supply would increase. Very few thought the demand would decrease, but almost 1/3, 29%, thought that the supply would decrease. So essentially, the situation that we're in now in terms of difficulty of hiring journey persons, employers are saying in the next couple of years it's going to get worse. What's this about? It all has to do with the demographics. We had a larger proportion of people enter the trades 20 or 30 years ago. That number has been declining, particularly as we've put more emphasis on encouraging youth to go to university. In a sense, we've been diverting people from other career pathways. And so the pipeline of people becoming journey persons has been shrinking. And employers are now finding that a large part of their workforce is older, and we'll get to some of that data in a moment. And they're retiring, and there's not as many experienced journey persons coming in. We have apprentices signing up, but the problem is that the people who are retiring have around 20 years of experience. Those apprentices are just coming into the workplace. It still takes them a few years to really get adept at the job they're doing. And this is what these slides are telling us, that not only it's really hard to hire a journey person, because there are fewer numbers. They're often looking for an experienced journey person, and they have a great concern about the immediate future because they see these looming retirements, and they don't see the next cohort producing the same numbers of experienced journey persons. And that's the essential concern that employers have. Okay, so when I was talking about those ages, here we show the data. This is again for registered journey persons, what their median age is. So median age is, if you have 100 people, what's the age of the person? If you took all the ages and lined them up chronologically, the age of the person who's at the 50th person in that line. So here are trades where over half of the workers are over 50 years old. So the median age for Halton, the median age for truck and coach technicians is 55 years old. That means half of all the workers are either 55 years or older. And same things with Peel, auto body and collision damage repairs. Half of the workers in that trade are 54 years or older, going all down to electricians and auto service technicians. Half of them are 50 or older. So you can imagine, here's a workforce, half is over 50. In 10, 15 years, many of them are going to be retired. And many of them already are thinking about changing their work, because a lot of this work is physical, and it does produce a fair amount of wear and tear over time. And even by the age of the mid-50s, late 50s, people are looking to move into other comparable occupations, but perhaps something that has more to do with sitting behind a desk or supervising others, as opposed to actually doing the hands-on work. So this is the demographic crunch we're seeing in terms of that baby boom generation. Another way we wanted to look at how can we estimate the degree to which we're seeing shortages was we wanted to compare the apprentices to journey persons. So the way we did this is we said, okay, so how many journey persons are there for each apprentice? And here we've listed the numbers, and this is only relevant for those where we have compulsory registration. Okay, for the voluntary, the numbers would be unreliable. So for compulsory registrations for Peel and Halton, you can see among hairstylists that basically for both Peel and Halton, there are around 10 journey persons for each apprentice. So we've got one apprentice for each journey person. So that replacement rate is going to be pretty low. You know, plumbers is at the other end, where we have one apprentice for each, 2.7, 3.3. So let's say one apprentice for every 3 journey person plumbers. You can see there that, we're getting a good pipeline, and this is not a pun about plumbing, but there's a talent pipeline that's coming, right? But in terms of like truck and coach technician, auto service technician, the numbers are, more problematic in terms of, who's coming in that may eventually be there to replace those who are retiring. Okay, back to the survey. So we know apprentices sign up, but we also know sometimes they don't complete it. So we asked employers, what's your experience with apprentices dropping out? And we gave them these choices. The majority of apprentices drop out, less than half drop out, very small number drop out, no apprentices drop out. So overall, you can say that 2/3 of employers, if we add that 50 and 18, so 68% say either no apprentices or a very small number drop out. Only a small portion would say that a majority drop out. They were more often among firms that were smaller, and I think slightly higher in the construction sector, as I recall. The reasons for dropping out, there were many reasons. Sometimes just the system was not very responsive, people complaining about not getting answers if they ran into a difficulty, not getting support, sometimes not being able to get, each year you've got to do a certain amount of classroom training. Sometimes that training, those classrooms were filled, so you couldn't do your classroom training, so you're put behind by a year. So a whole bunch of issues that come up in terms of not completing. But overall, probably the biggest reason that employers gave for why somebody didn't complete it was they said, it just doesn't really, it just didn't suit them. Like they started doing an apprenticeship and they realized that's not for me. Like, this is not actually what I want to do. So, it's interesting that, there still is a certain amount of trial and error in terms of figuring out what your career path is. And people would drop out because it just wasn't the job for them. We also asked about the impact of technological change. Okay, again, we provided a series of possible responses. So 57% of employers said that, yes, technological change is reshaping the skill requirements of the job. What does that mean? Well, in most cases, we're talking about you know, computer and digital skills in almost every field, you know, and not only obviously in the auto sector. You know, we have now cars that rely far more on electronics as opposed to on mechanical systems. Oops, sorry. There, that was my errant elbow. Um, but even, you know, tradespeople who are, you know, in other respects, like how work is organized, like you know, they're using you know, mobile phones to schedule, do their work schedules, to check in on work orders, or using tablets. You know, various other trades, like even like horticultural technicians. You know, they're using various sensors to determine the acidity of the ground or moisture, to know when to water plants and so on. And so what it means is that in every category, there's a greater demand for more skills. It's not just the kind of technical skills that were the traditional skills, but all these digital skills have now become important. A quarter of them saying technological change is having no impact. Certainly, there's a you know, a sizable minority who said that the training programs in the classrooms are not keeping up to the technological change that's happening in the workplace. And interestingly, only 6% said that technological change is reducing the demand for the jobs in this occupation. You know, we keep hearing about how the looming automation is going to reduce the number of jobs. That's not the perception of employers who are working the skilled trades field. They find that that only makes the job, it changes the nature of the job, it changes the skill requirements of the job, but they don't feel it's diminishing the demand for workers in that category. All right, so we wanted to get an overall assessment from employers about how they felt this whole apprenticeship system met their skill needs. And here are the results. So from one end, we have 16% say that the apprenticeship system is extremely effective at serving their skill needs, and 32% saying it's effective, 26% saying it's somewhat effective, and 26% saying it's not at all effective. Now, you know, I know people who have registered for this webinar. You come from different kinds of organizations, you provide services, you're employers, you provide employment services. We have a quarter of employers saying the apprenticeship system is not at all effective. We have another quarter saying it's somewhat effective. So half of the people who rely on the system are saying it's somewhat effective or not effective. That's not at all a ringing endorsement of the apprenticeship system. And it probably, you know, it reflects perhaps, you know, the reason why this study was undertaken in the first place. I think there's been an accumulation of grievances about how the apprenticeship system works. You know, I will say that employers are not complaining about the apprenticeship concept. They think they actually like the apprenticeship concept. They like the idea of most of the training taking place in the workplace. But the problem is the system, that there's all kinds of issues, challenges, barriers that arise, and we'll get to those in a minute or two. And it's a system that they find problematic in terms of delivering what they're looking for, which is, you know, a sufficient number of qualified people who are able to do the work. So here are those issues that these employers mentioned, and these are from the employers in Peel and Halton. And I'm going to take a moment to go through each of these bullet points. So they say, how can, you know, in response to the question, how can the apprenticeship system better serve the needs of employers? By far, the biggest issue that employers were mentioning was that we got to get more youth into the trades. So we got to promote the trades more. We have to promote it starting early, not just in high school, but maybe even in middle school, to already start identifying these opportunities. We've got to bring back more of the tech programs that used to exist in schools. The problem is that youth have no idea what these jobs are about. They don't know about what kind of work is involved. They don't realize that a lot of that work is also highly modernized now with all that introduction of digital skills and so on. It makes it a different type of work. They don't know the pay and the career advancement opportunities that exist in these areas. So there's a whole area that employers are very dismayed that youth are being told to that their basic career path is to university with the expectation they'll get a university job, and when in fact there's so many excellent jobs, very well-paying jobs that exist that are going begging. They felt that part of the problem is how people perceive the trade. So they felt you've got to brand these trades differently, as I mentioned before, even in terms of the modernization or the digital skills that are applied here. That people perceive skilled trades as being dirty work, only manual work, and in some sense also less valued work, that it's looked down upon, and that we've got to start changing that mentality with regards to these jobs. Targeting parents and guidance counselors is that it's not only telling youth about this stuff, because we have to also influence those people who influence the youth. The guidance counselors are in high schools are themselves a product of a university education, and so they've got a narrower perspective, or they actually have a blind spot when it comes to understanding all the opportunities that might exist in the skilled trades. Parents, have bought into the same view that only professional occupations like lawyers and doctors and engineers are the ones that they want their children to aspire to, when in fact there are again, lucrative and rewarding careers to be had in these areas. So they said we've got to make sure that in this promotion and rebranding that we target a wider audience. Then we get into some other more programmatic type issues. They felt, for some employers, it's hard to find apprentices. They said, why don't we have a platform where employers looking for apprentices and apprentices looking for employers, where there'd be some kind of clearinghouse where we can do some matching between openings and apprentice candidates. This issue of classroom seats. So in each apprenticeship, there's a requirement for a certain amount of classroom training. The problem is that sometimes there are a limited number of seats, a limited number of programs in a given geographic area. If one has to take a number of weeks off from work, one might have to go to a different location to actually take the classroom training because it's not available in your local area, and that's an extra cost, and it's a disincentive. And if you don't get that seat, then you're stuck. You can't advance to the next level. So that means your training doesn't advance, your pay doesn't advance, the time in which you can complete the apprenticeship is put off in the future, and sometimes is a reason why somebody may drop out. They'll figure, well, I've got some training. I will, especially if I'm in a voluntary trade, I'll just do with what I have. Bring back the one-to-one connection. So in years past, ministry staff would actually be, according to employers, would be much more engaged in the relationship between the employer and the apprentice. They would actually go out to the workplace. They'd sit down with the employer and the apprentice and go over what are the expectations in terms of the apprenticeship training. They'd be available to respond to issues or concerns that arise. And a number of employers were saying now it's actually, we don't see that personal relationship. We don't have that support. When we contact the ministry, it's hard to know who to contact. We leave them messages, they don't get returned for weeks. So a lot of complaints about the system, okay? And financial incentives for employers. Employers saying that it's a cost for us to train these people. Yes, we benefit perhaps down the road, but in the first in the first months, in the first year, perhaps we don't get much production. We have to take time to train. These people make mistakes that have to be corrected. Equipment might be broken as a result. So we need some financial assistance in order to be the trainers. But also employers were citing the fact that apprentices need more financial support. The pay scales they felt were low, that when they go for their classroom training, they don't have they're not getting paid. And so there's a kind of a period during which they require some financial support. In some instances, journey persons have to buy their own tools, which can be quite expensive in certain trades, and they felt there should be some way, at the very least, some kind of loan program that had favorable terms that could allow people to repay the loan as they start making more income. You may have heard about ratios that used to exist. There used to be specific ratios of how many journey persons would be needed in a workplace in order to train an apprentice. In the last 2 years or so, the ministry changed all those ratios so that it's now a 1-to-1 ratio. So if there's one apprentice, then you need one journey person in order to do the training. Well, some employers are saying, even that, yes, we're happy that those ratios have been adjusted, but in fact, we could do better. We can have one journey person train, for example, 2 apprentices, especially if they're at different years, like if one's a first-year apprentice, and now there's a third-year apprentice, they're at different stages. It's not such a great burden. And in that way, we'd be able to train more people. Next, make it easier to recruit skilled tradesperson from overseas. A lot of our immigration policy is focused on people with university degrees, often postgraduate degrees, and especially in the science, technology, engineering, IT sectors. We're experiencing a real shortage of skilled tradesperson, employers are saying, and why wouldn't we want to get skilled people in these categories and draw upon them, because it's going to take a while for these increased numbers of apprentices to build up their skills to be able to replace the experienced journey persons we have. Employers were happy that they were being consulted on this, and they said, what, we know this better than others because we're the ones who are dealing with it. Please continue to consult with us, was an issue. They wanted to see more soft skills brought into the curriculum for apprenticeship training, because that is becoming more and more a requirement across our labor force. They wanted to see, because they have complaints about the apprenticeship system, they wanted to see more ways in which the apprenticeship system can be held accountable. They wanted to have more reporting about numbers and more explanations, and also, I guess, targets in terms of response times to inquiries and so on, so that there's a way to assess how well the apprenticeship system is serving its various stakeholders. And then a couple of employers, there had been talk about perhaps breaking up some of the skilled trades into more series of different training programs for which one would get certification as a way to kind of accelerate some of the training that could take place in a number of fields where we're seeing shortages of workers, and a number of employers volunteered that they were concerned about diluting or diminishing what is the expertise that is lodged in a skilled tradesperson, okay, by breaking it up into smaller components. I'd mentioned as well that I had done this work in other regions, so I thought I'd throw up items that were heard elsewhere that did not come up in the consultations in Peel and Halton, because I think they provide a flavor of what people are saying in other parts of the province. All those things that are mentioned in that previous slide were almost always mentioned elsewhere, and it's really actually quite striking if you look at 5 or 6 different regions, how the themes were so common. It just speaks to how much these issues are prevalent and have been prevalent for quite some time, which again highlights the need for change in these areas. But in other locations, because you often had smaller communities, they say that the problems that we experience are even that much greater because we have many more smaller businesses. Okay, and that was one of their concerns. They also would raise the fact that once an apprentice had completed their training and now became a journey person, sometimes they would then be poached by another employer. Like if everyone has a difficulty in hiring journey persons, you can imagine that there's a small pool and everyone is competing for them. And they were saying, that's really unfair. We had gone through several years of training and then someone offers a higher wage and that person moves. So can we have some way in which to motivate people to stay with an employer by some kind of incentive program? In some other locations also, they complained that the testing there was too much emphasis on written testing as opposed to actually testing hands-on ability. And I think partly that reflects in some other parts of the province, unlike in Peel and Halton, there are kind of fewer people who have qualified, say, for university, and perhaps their skills are in other areas. And they said, let's test those skills as opposed to the kind of written knowledge about the skilled trades. People felt that it would be useful to have kind of more programs prior to an apprenticeship to introduce people to what an apprenticeship is about, so they get a feel for it to actually know if this is something they want to pursue. And finally, better enforcement, that some employers in these other areas thought that other employers were not following the same rules and guidelines in terms of how they did the training, and they wanted to see actually ensuring that the standards were being met by other employers. A few other items, we had talked about some of the other questions that or issues that we wanted to explore in addition to what the ministry was exploring. One of them, because of the way I told you before about how we had structured the survey, we actually guided employers to choose a skilled trade that they were going to comment on. So when we prepared the survey, we thought, well, this is interesting, like, because we know what trade we're dealing with, we know if it's a compulsory trade or if it's a voluntary trade. So as a result, we asked some questions asking the employer, okay, is this trade compulsory or voluntary? And the responses were kind of interesting. So for employers who had a compulsory trade, 3/4 of them knew it was a compulsory trade. And I got to tell you, to me, that feels kind of low. These are trades where people are required to be registered, licensed. They can't be employed in that category unless they are licensed and registered. And almost 1/4 of employers didn't know that trade was a compulsory trade. On the voluntary side, the numbers were even more out of whack. That only 58% could correctly identified that it was a voluntary trade. 42% thought that the voluntary trade that they were hiring people in was actually a compulsory trade. We asked employers who were hiring people in a voluntary trade, we said, how many of the people that you hire, how many have a certificate of apprenticeship or a certificate of completion? Like, because we wanted to get a sense, how important is that to them? Now, and the way we asked the question, we said is, okay, is 0 to 24% of your workforce has a certificate of apprenticeship or certificate of completion, or 25 to 49%, or up to 75 to 100%. Once we start breaking, cutting and slicing and dicing the data, we get small numbers, but even these numbers show a pattern. Essentially, the pattern is as follows. In most trades, the numbers kind of were concentrated at the two ends. You either had a group of employers who said very few of our people have a certificate, or they were saying almost all of our employees have a certificate. So essentially what that means is that some employers, it really doesn't matter. And this other employers, it really, really matters. And there's less in between, okay? And that's, so if you look at these numbers, you see that in most cases, well, in the case of construction and industrial, it's at two extremes. Even though the numbers are small, you can see the polarization. In the motive sector, almost all the trades are compulsory. So, you know, they're answering it as if they thought it was a voluntary trade. So they're saying, yeah, most of them have a certificate. Well, they do, because it's a compulsory trade in most instances. In the service sector, there's only one occupation that is a compulsory trade, and that's hairstylist. So there, almost all of them say, no, we have very few who have a certificate. Okay, so that's kind of the upshot of that slide. Then we asked, in terms of other occupations, how important was it, if those other occupations that were not skilled trades at all, how important was it for someone to have a skilled trade background to do that job? And so you see those occupations, we gave them categories, and you could see that there were quite a few where it made a great deal of difference. Over 50% wanted to see someone with a certificate in these occupations. So gas fitter. So the thing is, many people thought gas fitter was a skilled trade. It's not. There is a certification process for gas fitter, but it's separate from skilled trades. But so 2/3 of them said, yeah, I would want that person to be a skilled tradesperson. But then contractors of construction trades, or construction managers, or contractors in carpentry trade or home renovation, they would prefer that that person be someone who came up through the skilled trade ranks. Then you go down to the bottom of the list, and someone who's a janitor or a caretaker in the building, it really did not make that much difference. Okay, you can see the numbers. So this is what we found from that slide. Finally, as we were doing these various interviews, one of the things we learned was that there are some trades that we really wonder whether they should be skilled trades. And I'm going to walk through these with you here for a moment. So one is, we actually have around 5 trades of those 144 that are in the IT sector. And I'm listing them here. IT contact center technician, support agent, IT hardware technician. These trades were developed several years ago. And I'd say around 4 or 5 years ago, there actually were several hundred people who would register to be apprentices in these trades. Around, as I say, 4 or 5 years ago. By around 3 years ago, almost no one was registered in these trades. So I think these were trades that came up in response to the whole IT revolution, transformation. But from what we can gather, I don't think these were trades that could adapt as quickly to the changes that were happening in the IT sector. In speaking to employers who were deeply involved in the IT sector, in addition to an IT trade organizations, almost none of them even knew that these trades existed. Okay, so the certification process is done by all kinds of different ways, by various vendors who have certificate programs, and that is what the industry relies upon. The apprenticeship system is not serving their needs, and they're not even aware of them. We have a skilled trade called an educational assistant. This was an area, these are typically individuals who would work in schools, particularly often for special needs students, and we have an apprenticeship system for that. I will say that not only in Peel and Halton, but in many other areas where I did this project and where we interviewed school boards, even the school boards were not often, not always, but often were unaware that there was a skilled trade in this category, that the educational assistants were prepared in different ways. And there were other issues as well about having somebody who had limited training, who were getting their training in the workplace, acquiring that training and working directly with special needs children, for example, that they would have rather have them acquire some kind of certification in advance before they start working in the classroom. On the other hand, we have another skilled trade called child development practitioner, and that's particularly for daycare assistants. And that was a skilled trade that seemed to be useful. There I go with my elbow again. But that does not allow one to become a registered early educational educator, which is something that's regulated by the College of Early Childhood Educators. It allows one to be an assistant in that capacity. And so there did seem to be some value to that one as distinct from the educational assistant category. And then this one on tractor trailer commercial driver, which I mentioned before. We have the industry, it seems, would like to see more certification in this area because of issues around safety and so on. But there's so little take up of this that, again, it seemed that would warrant some further review of whether that's a trade that should continue. And then finally, it mentioned welders as well. With the Canadian Welding Bureau, there seems to be quite a series of different programs and certifications for different categories of welding that compared to the small proportion of welders who actually have gone through the apprenticeship system, that it raised for us the question of whether it made sense to have that as a special category. So that's the extent of the findings, of the content of the findings. As we mentioned before, that we had, we will have a report that will be coming out. But I think at this point, I know there are questions that have been posed. So I think we have I think at least 10 minutes to try and respond to some questions.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Matt. We're going to reach the point of our presentation where we answer some questions. So if we're unable to get to some of your questions, we're going to follow up with them after. But to start, one of the questions that came in, Tom, was, does the College of Trades still exist, or was it eliminated by the new provincial government?
So if you go to the website of the Ontario College of Trades, all their website is still there, but you are redirected, you are invited to go to a ministry website that provides information on skilled trades. But the last time I looked, which was around a month ago, there is no obvious replacement yet for the Ontario College of Trades. And again, I think there are probably people who are more in the know about this than I am. But what I'm understanding is now the government is trying to figure out how this function is to be carried out. So as I understand, there is not, so the Ontario College of Trades has been closed down, but how its functions are to be performed and the registration process, I don't see what the where that stands right now, and perhaps there might be others who are on this webinar who could tell us better, but I don't think we have a clear answer on that.
Okay. So the next question is there a cost to registration in the voluntary trades?
Yes. Yes, so voluntary, and that's one of the disincentives. It's not a great cost, but it's an annual cost. I can't remember. It's in the hundreds of dollars, I think. And so, a number of individuals, there's no reason for them. In many cases, there's no reason for them to be registered, except, as I said, like if you're a independent contractor providing, plumbing, well, not plumbing, but let's say carpentry is a voluntary trade. It helps to perhaps say that, oh, I'm licensed and certified by this body, and you can look me up. And I think so. There are sometimes reasons for it, and people do it, but for most, there's no reason. Like for a cook, I don't think anybody asks anybody if they're registered or not.
So you were talking a little bit about this idea that like in the public school systems, they weren't aware that certain skill trades existed. One of the questions was, should we not start promoting skill trades starting from elementary and high schools and more?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And I think I've seen different suggestions about what's age appropriate, and there's no reason why one can't, from a very early age, kind of include the full range of occupations that exist out there. That there's a tendency to kind of keep the focus more narrow. And then as one gets older, to introduce them to various hands-on activities, and then ultimately various career talks and visits to workplaces. And so so it's all how about to broaden the options that are available to students, and to let them know in a very clear way what these jobs involve. Because if you don't have in your circle someone who works in these categories, you really don't know what their work is about. And so sometimes one has to go to some lengths to bring in that perspective that might not exist among your immediate circle.
Thanks, Tom. And the last question is, how do you think the finding from this report will affect or are going to be affected by the impact of COVID-19 and its consequences?
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated issue. But I've certainly been thinking about this in a number of respects. So I guess a few things to be said. So there are two things happening now with the pandemic. One is a recession, and we know recessions. We understand recessions, and so I think a few things to be recessions. All of a sudden, economic activity drops. So we have less spending, less investment going on, because there's less consumer demand. People are out of work. All right. So all of a sudden we're going to have less work. So that's going to affect everybody. And you take the 2008 recession, and the first things that were impacted were manufacturing and construction. Those were heavily impacted, and that's where we saw a lot of job losses, particularly in manufacturing. But secondly, the thing about a recession is that one of the things that governments do very early on is they try and replace that lost economic activity. And a common way they do that is investing in infrastructure projects, because that's something that they fund. It's not dependent on the marketplace. And so as part of the recovery, we probably can expect to see again investments in infrastructure, and that is particularly an area where skilled trades are necessary. So the construction trades, right? Because that's right. So I think so I think we're going to see that same level of demand certainly on that side. So that's a recession. But here we're dealing with two things. We have this recession and we have this pandemic. And I think this is what makes this recession unique. We don't have this kind of experience. But there's a couple of things I'm going to say about the consequences and impact of the pandemic. One is behavioral. I mean, how and kind of practices we engage in. So all this social distancing, we have, as everyone who's following this, we're still not sure how long this will continue, and how long we will still, even as we return to work, we will still have to maintain social distancing practices, right? So that's going to affect employment broadly. But in terms of behaviors, certainly one of the things one's seeing in the literature are people saying, like maybe the way we've spread out all these supply chains and so on has been very problematic. That maybe we should be shoring more of that. Maybe we should be doing more made in Canada or made locally type of approach. In which case, there might be an argument to be made, or an expectation that our manufacturing sector may be rebounding slightly. Okay. So that might have, so here we have, on the recession side, we have, possible stimulus programs directed to infrastructure. We also may see, as we're coming out of the recession, an expectation that there be more things that are produced in Canada, which will create even greater demand on requirements for positions in manufacturing that involve skilled trades. But the third thing I'll say is, again, as part of this pandemic, I think we're also having a question about the kind of values that have been revealed. And I'll talk, this is not so much with regards to skilled trades, but the way we've spoken about essential workers, all of whom are mainly in entry-level, low-skilled positions, whether they're personal support workers or people who work in grocery stores, deliverers. There, I think a lot of people have been asking, wow, we now realize these people are much more essential to our needs than we ever imagined. And I think we may start seeing more expectations around different levels of pay for those kinds of jobs, because we realize, how much they've been ill-served by our economy, particularly those who have been working in the gig economy or working on contract or part-time positions that requires them to have several jobs. Like, it's really this crisis has exposed what terrible circumstances they often work under. And in the case of like personal support workers, how that practice has actually affected people's health in the long-term care facilities because of the movement between facilities. So I think there's issues around a recession, around how our behaviors are going to change, and also about how our values might change.
All right, thank you, Tom. So as we mentioned, everyone, if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up after and contact you and answer those questions as best as we can. I'm just going to hand it off to our Executive Director, Shalini Dakuna, and she's going to just close us off for today.
Okay, thank you very much for attending this webinar today. I hope it was useful to all of you in the line of work that you do, whether you represent a college, university, economic development, municipality, employment services, or an employer that works with trades. We've been consistently asked if the slides will be made available of this presentation today. Yes, please reach out to us and we'll make sure you get the slides. Somebody also asked us about the soft copy. At 10:30 today, we're going to be launching the complete report across all social media platforms. And if you're not able to get it through any of those methods, please reach out to us. Yes, we have a full comprehensive report beyond what Tom has covered today in his presentation. And this would be made available to everyone. I would like to let you all know about the second part of this webinar series, Take Your Workforce to the Next Level. We are going to be launching on May 1st, our next part of this report, next part in the series. This is around automation. We have researched the age of automation, technology, and the restructuring of the labor market in Peel and Halton. The challenge of automation has become an increasingly important topic in workforce planning and development, especially in the context of dialogue on the future of work. However, not much work has been done to understand the local impacts of the technological development on local labor market needs. Our study set out to assess the local impacts of automation and to develop an understanding of local ideas and responses to the growing impacts of technology on the local labor market. This presentation will review the context surrounding automation and technology in the local labor market and present the trends impacting Peel and Halton. The study represents a unique local perspective on national and provincial trends. An invite for this webinar will be sent to you next week. And I'm sure all of you would agree with us that the last few weeks have probably impacted automation and technology a lot more than we ever imagined. So this report is good. It was pre-COVID, but we can see that a lot has changed in the last few weeks. I'm just going to see if there's any urgent other message. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we will again, like I said, share with you the slide deck if you want. The soft copy of the report will be shared publicly across all social media today, and it will be made available to you. And have a great rest of the day and weekend. Stay safe and stay healthy.